So then there's a chapter on Emma Goldman, and there were things that I related to, such as she had the courage to fight for her convictions, but also the courage to challenge her convictions and admit her errors. So I find that, cognitive flexibility, I call it, is very important for being effective. Also, she had a fierce loyalty with a scorn for disloyalty and a repulsion for hypocrisy, which I also share. So talk about those traits in an anti-authoritarian.
Right. I mean, those are the things that are, for me, the folks that I talk about in the book that I had affection, even some of the folks who moved into, and I don't romanticize these anti-authoritarians, as you well know from reading the book. I have a section on folks who are self-destructive and violent anti-authoritarians. But the things that are impressive about the authoritarians who had triumphant lives that I talk about, or you're talking about Emma Goldman, is the willing to challenge their own convictions. So the one story, I'll give you an Emma Goldman story since you brought her up, was that in the, when she, Woodrow Wilson in the Red Scare, she and many others got deported, or either put in prison like Eugene Debs, or got deported. And so she ends up in Russia, and after the revolution there. And even though she wasn't a Bolshevik, she was an anarchist, she was still excited about the revolution there and getting rid of capitalism. And then lo and behold, she's going to keep her eyes open. She's not going to comply with anybody. She made enemies with Woodrow Wilson and young J. Edgar Hoover, but it was like she was going to see what the Soviet Union was all about. And she discovers that, oh, wow, the Lenin's here. He's an authoritarian, totalitarian guy. They are destroying the anarchist movement here. And so she writes a whole book coming after them. And knowing them now, she's not only the most hated woman in America already, read Emma here for like what she said about capitalism, but now because she's so committed to the truth and committed to admitting her mistake. And she talks about kind of laughing how sad it was that she spent all her time in America trying to get her buddies out of prison. Here she was in Russia after the revolution, and she was trying to get anarchists out of prison there. And she was just laughing about it. And that willingness, that self-esteem, that courage, that integrity to be able to say, like, wow, I care more about the truth than anything here. And that's what made her, that's what made Thomas Paine very impressive, and Malcom X too. Malcom X very similarly. He gave his life. He starts out in life, and he's really feels like the whole, the illegitimate authority of his life are white culture for good reason. They murdered his father here. He is subject to all kinds of racism. He got an extended more time in prison than he should have, and then he joins. For a while, he joins an authoritarian movement, the Nation of Islam. But when he discovers that he doesn't want to discover this, but his integrity, his honesty forces him to deal with the fact that, oh my God, the guy who's running this show here, Elijah Muhammad, is an illegitimate authority. He's a predator here. And I'm going to talk about it, even though I know that they, in cahoots with the FBI and everybody else who wants me dead, I'm a dead man. He knew that this was going to make him a dead man. And so when you see people like that who are willing to die, when you see, and I talk a lot about Edward Snowden, and who do these acts of integrity at the risk of either being deported, in prison, or even dying, and then you see other folks who are in position of power that young people respect that can't even talk some basic truths, it breaks my heart.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I mean, I was on the Sunrise Movement call, like what to do after Bernie, and they were basically encouraging them to support down ballot progressive Democrats. And I just thought that was such weak tea. I mean, these are young people who are idealistic. I compared that, and I used this video in a couple shows ago, Mario Savio in 1964, speaking on the steps of Sproul Hall, when he says, when the machine becomes so odious, you just have to put your body into the cog of it. And I asked Varshini Prakash, who is the, founder of the Sunrise Movement, on my show last year, I know that you like to do sit-ins in Nancy Pelosi's office, but would you do like the tar sands blockade people, where they chained themselves to the bulldozers when they were building the Keystone XL South? And she said, no, we're not going to do that. And I subsequently found out, they get funding from the Tides Foundation and the Packard Foundation. And there's a great book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. so many of these organizations, organizations that Bernie Sanders is steering his volunteers into. He had a volunteer thank you call, and then he had 8 of these leaders on, and they were all shilling for their organization, like join my organization, Dream Defenders, People's Action, Center for Popular Democracy, all these funded groups, that because of their funding, they're limited in not only their mission, but also their tactics. Speaking of Snowden and Assange, you get into a really interesting discussion of them and Chelsea Manning and some others. And you talk about how their principled dissent and civil disobedience was psychopathologized in terms of the framing of them by our government and the mainstream media, who I call stenographers of the corporate state. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. I mean, I have a whole section about how the different ways people who anti-authoritarians get marginalized. And so I go through how they're criminally, financially marginalized. But I have a chapter, and I feel this is my major job, being a psychologist. I have to speak truths about my own profession. I'm obligated to do that. And so I have a chapter, significant chapter on, about how people are anti-authoritarians are psychiatrically marginalized. And I should tell you a little backdrop from that. One of the reasons why I wrote this book was I've written about 5 or 6 articles over the years that have gotten, I guess you call it, go viral. And one of them was in 2012. I wrote this article that was called something like Why Anti-Authoritarians Are Diagnosed with Mental Illness. And it was republished on other websites. It's like, would we have drugged up Einstein? And it was, and it really, I still get email to this. It's years later, all the time off of it, from a lot of anti-authoritarians who say, yes, that's what I was really an anti-authoritarian. And because I couldn't fit in, because I was challenging authorities when I was young or at any age, I was labeled with this, that, and oppositional defiant disorder, the anxiety, bipolar, on and on. And so getting back to that specific passage that you're talking about, if you look back in history, when Snowden did what he did in 2013, when he first, revealed to the world here that the U.S. government was violating the 4th Amendment by this massive warrantless surveillance on its citizens. And what did they do? What did all the mainstream people did? And I talk about Bob Schieffer at CBS and all of these other mainstream sources. They, all of them in chorus, calling him all, he's grandiose narcissistic personality, narcissistic this, narcissistic personality, sort of over and over. It was like a chorus. They had all gotten the word. That's what we call this guy. Let's marginalize him that way. And I go through the same thing with Chelsea Manning, is like when she did what she did, which was whistleblowing on U.S. atrocities that she spotted. And by the way, both of these folks didn't live to be activists. They were they were loyal to the U.S. government. Edward Snowden joined the military before he got into an accident, tries to help out after 9/11. And Chelsea Manning, goes into the military. These were folks who really were super pro-American, but what they saw just appalled them. And so they had to do something about it. They had to talk about it because they had some integrity. And so what does the mass media do to Chelsea Manning? Well, they say, they just focus on, she's got gender bully issues and on and on. They try to discredit, marginalize her by psychiatric means. And I talk about a lot of other folks. I talk about, I don't know if a lot of folks in your audience may or may not have seen the movie Francis, about Francis Farmer, Jessica Lange vehicle. And it was like, here again, a very anti-authoritarian, Hollywood starlet who was was a thinker. I mean, for a Hollywood starlet at a young age, she was writing articles about whether God existed. She was visited the Soviet Union. She was wanting to be a real actress. And, and she, got angry. As a young woman, she got betrayed by a lot of men in her life. And she abused alcohol. She made some mistakes. And what did they do with her? Well, her family, she did some things. She ended up doing some really violent things in a courtroom. But it was easier for the studio, easier for her family to say, like, well, she's psychiatrically ill. Let's just marginalize her that way. That way we don't have to take seriously anything that she's saying. So over and over, you take a look at that the psychiatric diagnosis process has been used in a lot of different ways to not take seriously what people are saying, a way to marginalize them. And I could give you tons of other examples. Of course, I know a lot of other more non-famous people examples than famous people of that.
Yeah, you talk about what the psychiatric profession has done. Look at the Kennedys. I mean, Rosemary,
Right.
the older daughter, she would be classified maybe back then as mentally retarded. Now maybe it would just be developmentally delayed, and they lobotomized her. You know, again, a well-meaning, wealthy family. You know, because she was a little bit odd and obstreperous, and it was embarrassing.
Right, and I want to throw in there for people out there, because I work with a lot of parents over the years who feel awful about like what they subjected their kids to in terms of psychiatric treatments and throwing them in mental hospitals. And one of the things that and the Kennedys felt awful. They felt awful about what happened to their sister, you know, to her. And you know, what happens to a lot of families is when they see somebody acting in a really troubling way, creating havoc for the family or society or themselves, it's very scary. And so what happens when you're scared is that you're willing to allow some authority who is not authoritative, who really does not know what they're talking about, but is very good at sounding like they know what they're talking about. So you see a lot, my profession, and when I went to graduate school and I saw these psychologists, psychiatrists, I said, wow, that's what they're getting training in. They really don't know anything. They're learning a bunch of mumbo jumbo, but what they're really getting better and better is somebody who sounds like they know what they're talking about. The same thing with Donald Rumsfeld. So when I see guys like Henry Kissinger, Donald Rumsfeld, they remind me of all these psychiatrists and psychologists I went to school with. People that don't know what the heck they're talking about, but are very good at sounding like they know what they're talking about, especially when people are scared. When people are scared, they lose their critical thinking. And one thing I think I've seen some of the most intelligent people I know, they're in a scary position and they're vulnerable to somebody who sounds like they know what they're talking about. And so that's what I try to inoculate people for. Yeah. I try to vaccinate them from that.
You know, you also I wasn't going to ask you about this, but when you were talking about how they sound, you reminded me of that part where you talked about Harvard Business School. Yeah. How tell that story about how the Harvard Business.
Yeah, it's not my story. It's from, but anyways, the story was that she goes to what's her name, Susan, who wrote the book on introversion. That's on the tip of my tongue. Her last name. She wrote the book that did really well about being introverted, and she tells a story about going to Harvard Business School and how all these folks, if you're an introvert, you don't fit in. And they really want everybody to be extroverted and to sound like they know what they're talking about. And so, it's like they really tell folks is like, if you to be a leader there, that the goal is like, if you're like 50-50 on something, you got to sound like 100% of it. And she comes to the conclusion, like, these are the kind of folks who would, you ask them anything, how to go somewhere, and they're going to tell you where to go, even though they don't know what the heck they're talking about. So it's like that whole atmosphere. And that's what I learned, a lot of elitist training. A lot of people, this goes on, especially so in Ivy League kind of places, or Stanford, places at the more elite institutions, whatever these folks are in, that's what they're inculcated with. And then that they learn this demeanor of how to look like you're somebody in the know, because it works. It works. It fools most people.
About human nature. Okay, this is a big question. But I've always felt that people can be both good and evil. And I know those are value judgment terms, so let's put it different. People can be both cooperative and competitive. People can be both altruistic and greedy. So you seem to think, and maybe I'm getting this wrong just from reading this book, but it seems to me that you seem to think that if society is organized in a less hierarchical fashion, like the Native American societies you describe in that chapter, that people's good side will come out. So, I mean, I know this is a big question with philosophy, Rousseau versus Hobbes and all that sort of stuff, but about human nature, what do you think? Do you agree with me, or do you think that it's solely a matter of how you organize society?
Well, it is a big question, and certainly people have different personalities. They have different, and even if you take a look at, I'm no expert, I'm not an anthropologist here, expert on Native American societies, but in these different cultures, there certainly would be folks who would be problematic characters that were like kicked out, so, but I think overall, for me, that if you have, to the extent that you have a hierarchical society, and this book, this book on resisting illegitimate authority is written for and about anti-authoritarians, okay? And so for anti-authoritarians, to be in a hierarchical, the more hierarchical and coercive their society, their family, the more painful, the more enraging, the more resentful, the more anger it's going to create. Now, for other kinds of people, okay, once upon a time they were called squares. Nowadays, people call them normies. I don't know what you want to call them. But there are some folks who get their rocks off having authority say, good boy, and they pet them and they give them money. And one of the things that I try to make clear in the book is that, in talking about parenting, is that, sometimes, parents who are anti-authoritarians, you touched on George Carlin earlier on, and he had a rude awakening to realize that, like, wow, the kind of parenting I would have wanted as an anti-authoritarian, which was leave me the heck alone, stop controlling me. I like to learn on my own. That wasn't the kind of kid I had. And it took him a while to realize, that he had to be much more of a kind of traditional parent who had to kind of lay down some things here. And his daughter really appreciated that. And so a real lesson in life for me is for people to realize that there are different personalities. One, some people more introverted, some people more extroverted. There's a lot of different dimensions. But for me, what I was talking about is this whole dimension of anti-authoritarian people who I care about. That's the tribe. That's the group that I care about, that I feel is being bigoted against, who's getting a raw deal in America, who are being pathologized, who are being marginalized, who are being criminalized. And I wanted to kind of get the word out that this group of people, if you treated them in a different way, they're going to flourish better, okay? They're not going to respond well to hierarchical coercions. Trust me, I could go on and on that one.
Getting back to these psychological questions, now you talk about psychopathologizing and overprescribing drugs for things like depression and anxiety. And I too know so many, I don't think I know anyone who's not on one of those medications, let's put it that way. I've always said that, most depression is situational. You have a shitty life or something bad happened to you, you're going to get depressed. I don't think that many people are really clinically depressed with, like you talk about, the chemical imbalances. But even if they are, studies have shown that cognitive behavioral therapy is actually more effective than drugs. And I do think that your cognitions, these thoughts that you have about things, affect your feelings, which in turn affect your behavior. And if you can change your cognitions, you can change those feelings and then change your behavior and be more of an effective person. I wanted to know, since you don't really mention it in the book, what your feelings are about cognitive behavioral therapy as a form of therapy.
Well, first of all, it's common sense that it works, okay? And one of the things that's comical for me about my profession is they take a lot of things that people have known for thousands of years. Spinoza talked about cognitive behavioral therapy. This is just common sense kinds of things, and they make a big deal out of it. And as a way to kind of give them status and stature. So the idea is, sure, that the extent that you're capable of looking, if you look at things differently, you're going to have different emotional reactions to it. Of course, for me, that's common sense, and I guess I don't talk about it that much in any of my books here because it's kind of boring for me. There's nothing, it just seems like obvious, kind of thing. And so I spend my time, there's another thing to unpack. Every time you make a point, you say about 5 things I want to comment on. But the one thing that I do talk about off of one of the things that you're saying is that people have been brainwashed about this chemical brain imbalance theory of depression. And every time I get a chance when somebody brings that up, I need to let people know that even establishment psychiatry today now admits this was completely untrue. And it's like really, in many ways, the parallel is to the weapons of mass destruction. It was like they hoped that there were weapons of mass destruction so they could go into Iraq. When they came up with this it's actually worse than that, because they already knew that this thing had been disproven in the 1980s, 1990s. There was a lot of research because the drug companies and psychiatrists really wanted this thing to be true. They wanted it to be true that people who were depressed had low levels of serotonin. They wanted that so badly to be true. And so there's a lot of research on it. And by the time all these SSRIs, these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, started hitting the market in the late 1980s, and the time these drug commercials started hitting in the mid 1990s, they already knew it wasn't true. And if you listen to those drug commercials, they're covering themselves. Well, it may be, even though they knew it wasn't true. And so for me, I've been talking about this stuff for 15 years. And then it was really interesting for me. Two things happened in 2011, 2012. One was NPR, at least Spiegel, she does this report that really was like one of the first reports in sort of mainstream media, talking about when she was a teenager, she was depressed. She went to Johns Hopkins. She was told, her parents were told she was depressed because she had this chemical brain imbalance theory. And then as an adult journalist, she started to check into it, and she found out that all of establishment psychiatry was saying, like, no, there is no such thing. We just told that to people to try to get them to take their medication. She was sort of shocked. In 2012, the sort of a big event for a lot of people who were critical of the BS of psychiatry is a guy named Ronald Pies, who's sort of one of the cardinals of establishment psychiatry. He's an editor of something called one of the major psychiatric journals. He comes out and he basically says no well-respected psychiatrist ever believed in the chemical brain imbalance theory. It was an urban legend. And what he goes about, he says he blames everybody believing this on two forces. He blames them on drug companies, which is true. But then the other interesting thing he does is he blames the fact that everybody believes psychiatry pushed this on people who are critics of psychiatry, lying about psychiatry pushing it, even though, like, everybody I know or everybody I've ever talked to, they've gone to a doctor. Most of the time, I should also say these drugs are not being prescribed by psychiatrists. It's just usually just primary care doctors are prescribing them. But all of them, the polls show it over and over again. Even to this day, even if after psychiatry quietly saying like, oh yeah, it's not true. If you do a poll today, there hasn't been a recent one, but there was one in the early 2000s that showed the vast majority of Americans still believe that chemical imbalances cause depressions. By the way, the majority of Republicans still believe they found weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So once you tell a lie, something BS to try to get something, you tell it enough, even when people are saying like, oh, well, I guess we were wrong, people don't even know. So that's a big one that I need to keep putting out over and over again. It's not just Bruce Levine here. You could go ahead and Google chemical imbalance theory, Ronald Pies, establishment psychiatry. It's been thrown out.
Autism spectrum disorders, because you don't talk about that in the book. And I couldn't help but think of that when I was reading about these anti-authoritarians who are violent, like Alexander Bergman, Ted Kaczynski, and the guy who killed McKinley, whose name I can't pronounce.
Chalgaz. It's hard to pronounce. Chalgaz.
Okay. So you said that guy was socially awkward and did not play with other children. He was socially isolated. Kaczynski was bullied and teased. You didn't mention this, even though your book was written after these two incidents, but this fits the exact profile of the school shooters, specifically the Sandy Hook shooter, Adam Lanza, the Boston Marathon shooter, and the Parkland shooter. I mean, these were boys that either played violent video games or they were in these like fundamentalist chat rooms online because they were socially isolated, because they didn't have any friends. They were very susceptible to these influences. So, and they were diagnosed as being on the spectrum. So do you think that that's also BS too, the spectrum?
Well, let me tell you, it's not BS. For me, it's clearly, when I talk about, poor Leon there, who, by the way, even he shot McKinley, but he was a loyal, he could have gotten sent Emma Goldman to prison for 10 years. People wanted to lock Emma Goldman up for like influencing him because they had some contact, and he saved her butt. And so there was he had some integrity about him. He was a sad kind of character who was kind of, pretty alone in the world, and he just couldn't connect with anyone. He couldn't even connect with anarchists. All of those folks that you mentioned, not so much Berkman, he's a different category, but certainly Kaczynski and some of these other folks, they didn't fit in really well, okay? But the bottom line was, okay, did they have illness? Did they have disease? Let's talk a little bit about Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. I mean, it's a myth that he was completely isolated. I go through that in his profile. There were people who he was friendly with in Harvard in his early days when he went there. He had folks in high school. There are people who talk about it like he was quiet, but once you started to be friends with you, you couldn't shut him up. And so he had friends. He actually even played sports. What happened to Ted Kaczynski? Well, a lot of things happened that got him really enraged. But at his trial, and his family members who talked about that, probably one of the major things that really got him enraged was that when he was, I think it was a sophomore year at Harvard, he innocently, naively participated in a psychology experiment with one of the most famous psychologists. One of the more and other major embarrassment colleagues in my profession here. Okay, a guy named Murray. And what did he do to this Kaczynski? This is an experiment. It's like they tell Kaczynski, go ahead and write down what are the most really things that you care about most in life. We want you to really make yourself vulnerable, put out all the most important things. Then what do? They bring in some guy, to really mock him and humiliate him about all these things they really care about. They videotape this, they show it to him over and over again. This process goes on for a couple of years. I mean, my profession, I'm not saying we're solely responsible for creating the Unibomber, for creating this guy who, killed 3 people, who injured many, many more. I mean, I'm not saying it, but we were part of that. And when you take a look at some of those teen shooters, okay, and I followed some. I'm not considering myself an expert on these teen shooters, but I have an interest in them. You take a look at some of those guys at Columbine. Take a look at Eric Harris and Dean Claiborne and Dylan Claiborne. These guys went to anger management. They were treated, okay, by my profession. One of the dudes, one of those guys, it was Eric Harris. He was put on an antidepressant, Lovix. It was found in his bloodstream, okay, after he was dead. And so part of the thing is that what I'm trying to say is not that these kids aren't really troubled kids, okay, and have had some problems, maybe temperamental personality problems, all kinds of things. But a lot of what ends up my profession has done with these folks is historically made it worse. And people are kidding themselves if they're thinking that the answer is more early assessment and more treatment. Because a lot of these folks, that has happened and it hasn't helped. In fact, in some cases, you can make an argument my profession has made them worse. So we have to look harder at what to do to solve the problem of all these mass shootings.
This book is so fantastic. And all my friends who are activists are going to love this book too, because you're going to relate to every single one of these characters in here. But I wanted to talk about anarchism because prior to my getting involved in the Occupy movement, I too, like most people, thought it was violence and chaos. I didn't realize that it meant democracy without government. Talk about why anti-authoritarians are so drawn to anarchism.
One of the things that I say is that not all anti-authoritarians are anarchists, okay? So people like Ralph Nader, they believed in government. Thomas Paine believed in government. So, but anybody who's a genuine, real deal anarchist, they are definitely an anti-authoritarian. So an anarchist, really is somebody who is passionately opposed to any kind of hierarchy. They're passionately opposed to any kind of imposed authority. And it gets interesting. Among anarchists, there's not a monolithic view of, like, for even the issue of authority. So Noam Chomsky, who considers himself an anarchist, I give an example. He says, look, if a kid's running out in traffic, and you act in an authoritarian, not just an authority way to grab the kid, coerce him from getting run over by a car. But he says, and I totally agree with Chomsky here, is that you can justify that authority. Can you justify it? And he goes on to say most of the authority of our society is just there to meet the needs of the corporatocracy, the power elite, and it's unjustified, illegitimate authority. But like I said, there's some anarchists who believe, that the whole issue of authority is huge in anarchism, but there's other issues too. Besides being opposed to any kind of hierarchy, they're also caring a lot about mutual aid. So you saw all that in Occupy. Occupy was very much an anarchist sensibility. People may or may not have, a lot of people throughout history don't necessarily identify themselves as anarchists, but they are in this sort of river of anarchism, which cares about sort of like not having a unnecessarily hierarchical form of society, not having being imposed authority, that you have control over your life, that they care about freedom, and they care about mutual aid. They care about people helping each other and being able to choose who helps one another. So these are fundamental things. Now, what happened, unfortunately, in the history of anarchism was that a lot of famous anarchists became violent. There's reasons why people have associated anarchism to violence and chaos unfairly.
I did a show called Occupy COVID-19 about a month ago because that's what we needed to do. Occupy Sandy, which happened after Hurricane Sandy, was actually more effective than FEMA or the Red Cross, because they were actually going and engaging with their neighbors and finding out what those people needed. FEMA and the Red Cross were just dumping like big packages of diapers or water bottles in the middle of the street. And I think the mutual aid, and it's happening all over Los Angeles with this pandemic, is really shows the beautiful spirit of how people, mutual aid, not charity, empowers people to be right, self-governing and have agency and efficacy in their own lives. Going from a big subject to a bigger subject, which is the role of God. And you talk about Spinoza's God of nature. Now, I'm an atheist, and like most anti-authoritarians, I've always derisively viewed religion as the opiate of the masses. I've gotten a lot more tolerant of religious people over the years, because I do see that it gives them a sense of, they have a lot of rituals, which are very comforting, and rituals are important for kids. You talk about Helen Keller and Harriet Tubman, and how they felt they were chosen by a supreme being to lead people out of oppression. So can you talk about the role of God and religion within anti-authoritarianism?
Okay, again, you're asking me these huge questions, but let me, to kind of go back to Spinoza and Einstein. I mean, one of the fascinating things, there's a lot of people out there who are like scientists, physicists, biologists, who, when they find out that that Einstein said, he believed in the God of Spinoza, this is interesting to them, because he is an idol for many scientists out there, Einstein. And why he did was and I think this is really important to the other question that you asked about, about Tubman and Keller, is that the idea of like what God is not singular. Okay, so for Spinoza and for Einstein, God was not just the same as nature. Okay, nature for them was like everything. The laws, for example, E=mc² for Spinoza, that was God. It wasn't just the mountains and the grass, it was everything. And so that's Spinoza's kind of view. And that's what Einstein said, well, this is really interesting. And I could buy into that God, and it all fit. Now, for people like, like Harriet Tubman, she was really interesting too, because she said quite bluntly, that part of the Bible that talks about slavery being okay, she didn't say F that, but maybe she did. She just said, to hell with that. That stuff they got wrong. But the part of the Bible about Moses leading people into a promised land, that's me. I am the black she Moses. This is what Harriet Tubman said. And so that view of taking selectively aspects out of the Bible for somebody like Harriet Tubman gave her strength, gave her power. And by the way, I should also add, I talk about Harriet Tubman, I sort of like joke around a little bit in the book. I said, thank God she only had to worry about slaveholders and not modern psychiatrists. We'll come back to trashing my profession again with Harriet Tubman. It was Harriet Tubman. She had hallucinations. She heard voices all the time. And people have said, like, they blame it completely on, and maybe we don't know for sure exactly why she had these auditory hallucinations, talking to God and all that. Some people say, well, because she got hit in the head by a slave master early on, and they affected some temporal lobe stuff. Maybe that was the case, but also is the case. I've talked to a lot of other people who you'd never know. They've never been diagnosed with schizophrenic, but they hear voices, and they're empowering voices, and that's what Harriet Tubman had. And that gave her strength. And people talk about her, even people who were in the Underground Railroad who chronicled it. They say, like, we never met anybody with this kind of courage in our entire life, because it took enormous courage to escape once. Like Frederick Douglass, he escaped once, and Frederick Douglass was in awe of Harriet Tubman. Says it was tough enough to have a guts to escape once. She kept on going back over and over again. People say maybe 13 times. Nobody's for sure how many times she went back, but something like that. And how did she do that? She was just utterly fearless. And part of her fearlessness was that she had God on her side. And that's a very different kind of God than a lot of other people. So when you talk about Spinoza and Einstein's God, Harriet Tubman's God, some other kind, that people have very, very different views of God. And some of them, for me, pragmatically, are very, very helpful, as far as, at least in my value system.
Yeah, well, I always say that about religion, is that the thing that I take from Judaism, from my Jewish education, is the concept of tikkun olam, healing the world, rather than the God stuff.
You would love Spinoza if you read a lot more about him. He actually got excommunicated in 1656 by the Jewish synagogue. I mean, it was the most severe, nasty, it's called a herem. It's a kind of a banning and ostracism. This what happened to him in 1656 for a lot of reasons, because he didn't believe that the Bible was sacred, because of his view of God, and because he also said, and this really, he said a lot of things that really scared the Jewish community that would get him in trouble with the Christian community about the Bible. But he also said things like he didn't believe that the Jews were a chosen people. So a lot of things about Spinoza and he just became a pariah. Yeah, he was like more of a pariah than Ralph Nader, I should tell you that. He probably people speculate if he didn't have severe respiratory problems in his mid-40s that killed him, he might have gotten assassinated because he was such an anti-authoritarian. Very nice guy. Got along with everybody, actually gentle soul, but he was fearless in terms of not only challenging the political authorities of his day, but also challenging the Jewish authorities who basically kicked him out. And he's still, by the way, excommunicated. Every show there was recently in Holland that they made a case to try to get him back in to rescind the excommunication. They said, no, we're not taking him in. Ben Gurion tried to get him back in. They wouldn't do it.
This is the quote that I like the best. Minimizing resentments and resolving them before they become lethal are critical to relationships. Resentments occur when people feel discounted, disrespected, used, abused, or coerced. Coercion is intrinsic to Western culture's employment, schooling, and parenting. In Western culture, compared to many indigenous cultures, there is little effort at minimizing resentment, and people are routinely unskilled at resolving small resentments before they turn into unresolvable poisons. In Western culture, the decision-making continuum ranges from complete authoritarian control, as in the military, to majority rule in elections, resulting in many people being discounted and resentful. So I've come to learn in my work and, in activism and in parenting that obviously, interpersonal relationships in general, that communication skills are key, conflict resolutions skills are key. They have great anti-bullying curriculums in school. They have courses in what's called nonviolent communication. All this stuff is great. Oh, and later you say how you deal with anger is critical to tragedy or triumph. So talk about resentment and anger on an interpersonal level and on a societal level. And if you want to use your examples of the anti-authoritarians, one where they had good interpersonal relations helped, one where it's bad and it hurt, you could do that.
Right. Well, I'll start with the anger, because for me, that's one of the things that when I started writing that book, I had certain things I knew I was going to talk about. And by the time I was done with the research of all these different anti-authoritarians that I wanted to focus on, it became clear to me that this was a dimension that I hadn't intended on highlighting as much. And so it was a huge deal that I came, that it was like, and it's obvious as soon as I saw it, was that like, if you're going to be an anti-authoritarian, a real deal anti-authoritarian in American society, you're going to have anger. You're going to have anger about what was done to you, okay, about how you were marginalized. But even if for the people who are lucky, like people like Noam Chomsky talks about his luck, he got lucky. That's one of the reasons why, there was a lot of other things he did smart and he was wise about. But he also says for a lot of anti-authoritarians who have decent quality lives, a lot of it was lucky. But even a guy like, you could feel it in Noam Chomsky, this is anger he's got. And why? Because even if you've been lucky, you've got anger about what's been done to other people, your friends, you've got anger in general about social injustice. So for me, I've never met a real deal, genuine anti-authoritarian in my life who didn't have some degree of anger, okay? And so therefore, it becomes like, what do you do with that anger? If you lash out with that anger, you act violently with that anger, or do you use that anger as a fuel to show like, I'll show you? Okay, so I give examples of both of those things. I mean, there's a lot of obvious examples of people like, and I feel sorry for people like, when I was growing up, I was a teenager, I really was so upset and so enraged by the Weathermen, because it was so obvious to me, like these guys are going to get, these guys, by the Weathermen, for your younger viewers there, they don't realize that these were folks who were part of the Students for Democratic Society, who realized that their typical peaceful protests weren't ending the war in Vietnam, weren't doing anything about racism, and they got violent. They started bombing things all over the place. And what happened was that it was clear to me, even as a teenager, it was like, this is heaven for Richard Nixon. He is like, now he sends people, you are acting almost like agent provocateurs. You're giving them an excuse to be more authoritarian. And that's in fact what happened. I mean, Nixon loved it. It helped fuel his law and order campaign in 1972. He wins by a landslide. So historically throughout American history, a lot of people who a lot of those people were, folks who really genuinely cared. They weren't on ego trips. They really just got so upset, nothing that they were doing, their demonstrations, their protests, and they were so enraged, they moved into violence with them, and it made things worse. And so that's a big part of the point of the book. Watch out what you do with your anger. Other folks I talk about, another guy I talk about who not one of the more famous anti-authoritarians I talk about in the book is Scott Nearing. He's well known if you go to like the New England among like homesteaders and back to landers and organic farmers. He's very well known in Vermont and Maine because this is a guy who again was marginalized during speaking out against World War I. He was a professor, lost his job, and he goes, and he can't work, can't make a living. And in the middle of the Great Depression, he goes and he decides like, well, what the heck, I'm going to go, the whole left wing is being destroyed in America here. He goes off first to Vermont and then ultimately to Maine, to back to land, become an organic farmer and doing all that. And what ends up happening to him is he takes his anger and says, like, I'll show them. They're not going to kill me. And I'm going to show them that my way of life, I may not be able to change American society, but I could create what he calls, him and his wife, Helen, they write these books called The Good Life. And what happens is in the 1970s, when a lot of young people were feeling like disgusted with Americans, started going back to the land, they found out about Scott Nearing and he became this hero. And so all of a sudden, this guy, he's in his 80s, he's 90s. By the way, he lives to 100 years old. He becomes this legendary guy. And it's all, a lot of it because it's like what he did with his anger. He had this I'll show you attitude here about like, I'll prove my way of life. And so I go through many other folks that how they use that anger as a fuel to be more constructive versus folks who lash out with their anger and they make matters worse. So that's the topic of anger that it's a really important one for me. And the last section is 8 anti-authoritarians who had more triumphant lives. And compared to the folks who had more self-destructive, violent lives. And a key variable was their relationship. So a lot of these folks who had, if they didn't have supported marriages, so Frederick Douglass, Noam Chomsky, a lot of these folks, they had supportive marriages, people like Jane Jacobs, who we haven't talked at all about, who's a real interesting urban anti-authoritarian I spent a lot of time with. They had very supportive marriages. But even folks who a lot of folks don't know that people like Henry David Thoreau, they think he was like a loner. He had a lot of good friends. He had a lot of pals. He had a lot of community. So a lot of these folks who really ended up having pretty fun lives, they built relationships. They understood really how important it was. Frederick Douglass, a lot of people don't realize what a networker that guy was. He built ties with the women's movement. He built ties all over the place. He really cared profoundly about relations. He also knew how to make a buck, by the way, too. That's another important thing. If you're going to be an anti-authoritarian American, you don't have to be a capitalist, but you're living in a moneyed society. You got to figure out a way how to make a buck. And even Emma Goldman, who's an anarchist, and Frederick Douglass, they figured out how a way to make a buck. And so by those things reduce your rage level to the extent that you have supportive relationships, to the extent that you're not completely out of control financially, your rage level is going to be diminished some, and you're going to be able to act with a little bit more wisdom. So, relation, as opposed to the folks I talk about who had more self-destructive lives, one of my great heroes as a teenager growing up was the folk singer. I talk a lot about Phil Oakes, and he was, a fantastic hero as a teenager. He was the guy, he was the folk singer. Any anti-war movement, he'd come out and sing for free. People would burn their draft cards while he was singing. He was a hero for a short period of time when that genre of political folk music was in. But he's, between his substance abuse, another problem that people, anti-authoritarians, get into, and hanging out with people who really maybe don't care that much about you, were part of the soup, part of the toxicities that ultimately led him into being suicidal. He ended up killing himself, hanging himself in his mid-30s. And so those are, moving into problematic, resentful relationships, moving into being out of control financially, moving into substance abuse. These are some of the problematic things that anti-authoritarians do that result in them leading more problematic lives.
You talk about anger, like my ex-boyfriend, who is totally apolitical, and if he is at all political, he's a moderate. He would always say to me, "Why are you so angry all the time?" And I said, "I'm not angry, I'm passionate." And what you're noting is righteous anger. And if activists didn't have righteous anger, if we were just okay with the way things were, there would never be any change. And my ex-husband used to say, oh, don't you just want our sons to be happy? And I'm like, well, define happy. Because I think that if you don't teach them about the value of purpose and meaning in their lives, and all happiness is about is momentary pleasure, then they're not going to be really happy. What are your thoughts about that?
Right. No, it's funny. I get to that question, but you're reminding me about this. It's like, why are you angry all the time? One of the things that you reminded me of is a Henry David Thoreau story where Henry David Thoreau, he doesn't pay his poll tax. It's his act of civil disobedience. He knows he's not going to do prison time significantly. He's going to get thrown in jail for a few days. It's not that big a deal, but he gets thrown in jail for a few days for it, and he gets visited by some friend. I'm not sure if it was Emerson or somebody else. Gets visited when they say to him, says like, Henry, why are you in jail? And he just immediately says like, why are you not in jail? Because not paying the poll tax supported the Mexican War, which is about slavery and stuff like that. So he had reasons. He damned if he was going to pay that. People who really are driven and striving to be happy, I think, for me personally, I don't want to judge it. It just seems like not a great idea. I mean, it's like you can care about what you really care about, and a lot of times, for me, for example, if I'm doing something that I really care about, I'm working on a book, or I'm talking to somebody that I really care about, I'm there and doing that. And later on, I realized, oh, that was kind of energizing. That felt like fun. Am I aspiring, like, trying to help people to be happy? No, one of the, again, getting back to young people, one of the great sadnesses for me is that a lot of them, they've been kind of doubly, I guess we could use this language on your show, doubly fucked, the young people. One is that they've been straddled with a horrific society of student loan debt, crappy jobs, and all environmental disasters, on and on and on. But the other, and also doubly, why I say doubly, is that they've been told that they have to be happy, and they're a loser if they're not happy. There was a book actually a bunch of years back. I wrote this depression book in 2007, and I talked about this issue at length. But one of the reasons one woman gave, I can't recall her name, which is a journalist, Leslie Hazelden, something like that, is she talked about that one of the many reasons why people are more depressed than the depression rates are going up, and there's a lot of reasons for it. I don't want to say this is the only one, is that pressure to be happy. So when you're not happy, now you really feel doubly screwed, like I'm supposed to be happy, which people didn't feel so much at other points of history. So I'm like, for me, maybe there's some people in life that they live to be happy, it works for them and blah, blah, blah and all that. But the kind of people I know, especially anti-authoritarians, this idea of like pressuring themselves to be happy, it just makes no sense to be thinking about that.
I think it's important to sort of define the different kinds of happiness there is. Especially if you're a parent and you're raising children, because if they just think happy is always pleasure, then they're going to be constantly pursuing pleasure and not meaning. And I feel that ultimately the meaning and purpose is more fulfilling than momentary pleasure.